Greetings, folks. For this lecture, what I think I'd like to do is talk to you a bit about the history of the 14th and 15th centuries, particularly as they relate to language change in England, and then take a look at some specific developments in the language, such as changes in the patterns of nouns, changes in prepositions, that kind of thing, and then for our final unit on Middle English, which we'll do next week, we'll look at some specific vocabulary questions. At least that's how I see it working out right now. In the meantime, I suppose just sit back. We'll talk a little bit about the history of a couple of very exciting centuries and see how that goes. One of the first categories that we need to discuss is population decline. And you might ask what population decline could possibly have to do with language change, but there are a few ways in which it actually can be important. One, a significant population decline reduces the workforce. This creates opportunities for people to move from where they are to where they might have a chance of making a better life. That is, population decline opens up possibilities for population movement. Another is that a drastic population decline destabilizes the society itself. It upsets the mechanisms that keep societies running fairly smoothly, at least a reasonable part of the time. That is, it creates an element of uncertainty, and in uncertainty, you also have opportunities for language change. People are looking at the world differently, thinking differently, and interacting differently, and, as I mentioned a moment ago, moving about differently. Now, as for the early 14th century, there was in 1315 to 1317 a very, very bad famine in England, a famine in which the population decreased by maybe as much as 10%. Sorry, I shouldn't have said decreased, because that sounds passive, it sounds sanitary. So let me rephrase. A famine in which perhaps as much as 10% of the population of England died because of starvation or starvation-related causes, illnesses associated with malnutrition, for example. Now, as you probably will expect, the worst effects were felt among the lowest classes, among the poor, among the peasantry. And yes, that is devastating. The people doing the work to support the society are virtually always the ones who are seen as most disposable, and the ones who have least access to help, to additional resources when their regular resources fail. But, and we're going to come back to this in a couple of slides, that sudden drop in population, especially among the poor, opened up opportunities for survivors that actually had or began to have a transformative effect on the society as a whole. An effect that was to roll through the next few generations as various other catastrophes played their own roles in both population decline and overall social instability. It's worth noting as well, just maybe as a side note, that during the Middle Ages, society was what we would call downwardly mobile. That is, it seems that in many years, the peasantry, the lowest classes, didn't actually reproduce enough to replenish their numbers, but people from higher classes than them kept falling down the social ladder. So even though the numbers of the poor sometimes would increase, much of that increase came from above, because the mortality rates among the poor were so much higher than the mortality rates among the more well-to-do. But of course, because the mortality rates among the more well-to-do were relatively low compared to the poor, but the system of primogeniture, the eldest son inherits everything, was in place, very firmly entrenched, this left a lot of younger children on that downward slide into poverty and obscurity. This may also account, to some degree, for a number of everyday words in English coming from French at around that time. This is just speculation on my part, but I thought I'd just throw it out there as a possibility. But if you thought a famine that killed 10% of the population was bad, that was just the warm-up act for what would follow about 30 years later. The Black Plague, the bubonic plague, had its first and most devastating run through Europe in 1348, beginning in southern Italy, I believe, if I recall correctly, and spreading by year's end throughout Europe, wiping out, by some estimates, as few as 20%, and by some as many as 50% of the population of Europe. So probably somewhere in the 30% range is reasonable. This is devastating. I don't know how a society would cope with that. And I say this, of course, as a person speaking to people coping with the worst public health crisis in the last 100 years. And looking at how that, the really relatively very small percentage of our overall population that has died because of COVID-19, and the effect that that's having and will continue to have on our society. Now imagine how that would look if 30% of us, within the space of a year or two, died. And of course, again, as always, this disproportionately affected the poor, for reasons that are probably obvious, but I'll say anyway. The poor, the peasantry, the people who were more or less bound to the land, had nowhere to go. The nobility, of course, had, in many cases, multiple estates. If the cities or the towns were bad places to be, and they were, then they could go to the country estates. They could lock up their walls and ride it out as well as they could, and many did. But the peasantry didn't have that option. There are cases of entire villages simply disappearing, being wiped out by this disease. Whole tracts of farmland going fallow because there was nobody to plant them, nobody to harvest them. And if you take a look at the art from the period, there's an obsession with death that is really, really stunning. There's a very famous motif called the Dance of Death, and it's the Grim Reaper leading what almost looks like a bunny hop, a line dance. And the line consists of people from all ranks of society, and they're just all going down to death. There was this sense at the time that the world was ending. And, for 30% of Europe, it did. The religious, which of course included most of the population, tended to see this as a judgment from God because they didn't know medicine or anything like that. As you might expect as well, just looking at our own society, there was also an increase in xenophobia. The other was blamed very easily. The other is always very easily blamed. And in this case, the other was the Jews. There was an increase, a drastic increase in anti-Semitism, which had already been officially endorsed and propagated by the church many, many times. But let's look at the bright side of the worst plague that we know of in recorded history. And I hinted at this in the last slide as well. With a large population of working poor, wages are a buyer's market. The people paying the wages set the wages. This means wages will be low. Standards of living will be kept low. If an employer has the opportunity to fuck you over and get something out of you, you will be fucked over and something will be gotten out of you. That is just the way it works. But when the workforce is dropping like flies, when the workforce is dying to the point where the demand for workers can no longer be met by the supply of workers, well, then all of a sudden the power is in the hands of the workers and people can ask a decent wage. And for the survivors, standards of living went up because people actually could demand to be paid a decent amount for the work they were doing. And of course, there was a lot of land up for grabs, and a lot of people who had little bits of land came into more land, had little bits of property, came into more property, because property never goes away. Land never goes away. So what happened in the mid-14th century among the survivors of that first wave of the Black Plague, which would then never really go away through the end of the Middle Ages and the early modern period. But what happened there is that there was a sudden rapid increase in what we call the middle class. Now, you look at any period in late medieval, early modern history up until the present time, the present decade when the middle class is in decline. One of the descriptions that you'll always see is this period is marked by an increase in the middle class. Well, the last half of the 14th century really was. And what this gave workers also was a taste of power, a taste of having control over their own lives, a taste of not being bound to the old social orders that told them what they were was what they were born to, and that was all they could ever be and all they could ever hope for. Well, the government hated that. The nobles hated that. But the nobles had other problems too. And there were things happening among the nobility that also are very important linguistically speaking. But I haven't talked that much yet about why the plague matters from a linguistic point of view. And that is, again, as with the famine, it moved populations. People would, if they could, leave devastated areas. They would pack up their belongings and travel to where they thought it might be safer, to where they thought that they would have more opportunity. And of course, they would take their language with them. Most of the population was still relatively stationary. But the movements particularly among the lower classes, the peasantry, the working people, were enough to begin carrying linguistic elements out of their little tiny local spheres in which they'd been kind of confined for the last many generations. But as I said, there were other factors in play too, and here I think we need to go back a decade or so and take a look at some of those. So let's talk about the 100 Years' War, which technically wasn't a single war, but a series of conflicts punctuated by periods of relative peace, some of these quite long, during which quite a lot of trade took place. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The 100 Years' War was fought over the question of who would get to rule France. The House of Valois, the French royal house, or the House of Plantagenet, the English royal house. Ultimately, by 1453, the French came out on top, and the English lost all of their possessions in France except for the port city of Calais. But during the 116 years of this punctuated conflict, there was, of course, a lot of backing and forthing between England and the continent. English armies were frequently in the field in France. Well, what happened here is this took English, both nobility and commoners, foot soldiers, into a country that spoke another language. It brought them into contact with another culture, another language. And in the case of the nobles, often brought them into contact, civilized contact in many cases, with nobles from the other side, from the French side. Even if they were prisoners of war, noble prisoners of war tended to be kept very comfortably. They were ransomed, and while they were being held for ransom, they would usually live relatively comfortable lives, often with access to such things as libraries, decent food. Now, the peasants, it was another story. They would just tend to be killed. But as we talked about with the Crusades in our conversation on Friday, whenever you have armies venturing off to war, you have people coming into contact with languages, customs, peoples with whom they wouldn't normally come into contact, and they are going to bring some of that contact home with them. This will, in other words, affect language. Now, the flip side of that, and I think this is really more important than what I was just talking about, was the ongoing increase, the ongoing rise in English nationalism, in seeing the French as that hostile other, and in therefore embracing all things English. Now, as I mentioned, I think in the last class, or it may have been in our Friday conversation, French by this point, by the later Middle Ages, was already in decline in England because of the forcing of the cross-channel nobles, the English-French nobles, to choose between their English holdings and their French holdings after 1204. From that point on, as I said, French became more of an artificial acquisition, a cultured acquisition, than a first language among the English nobility. And it was, in fact, during the 100 Years' War in 1366 that Edward III held the first English language parliament in England in 300 years. This was the same year, incidentally, in which Edward formally repudiated the papal claim of supremacy, of feudal supremacy over England. That is, the Pope was convinced that everyone in Europe held their lands ultimately from him. And 1366, Edward III was having none of it, finally. So this assertion of Englishness from the highest level of English nobility in the mid-14th century certainly is tied in with the rising nationalism of the 100 Years' War. But this increasing sense of self-conscious Englishness that we see with the readoption of English as the language of Parliament and the assertion of English supremacy over England as opposed to papal supremacy over England speaks to a growing sense of cultural confidence among the English, that they were not second-rate Europeans, which for the last few centuries, since the Norman Conquest, had been the predominant tenor of how Englishness had been viewed. And what we see in the 14th century is I think, a healthy self-assertion, and this is definitely reflected in the language. But it wasn't just famine, disease, and war that was contributing to change in English society in ways that would affect the language. There was also religious change in the air. There were a number of reasons for this. The one I want to focus on right now is what's called the Lollard heresy by the Catholics, or just Lollardy, which was a popular movement in England, particularly northern England, in the 1380s. Now, exactly where the term Lollard comes from, we're not exactly sure. The best speculation that I've encountered is that it may come from the Middle Dutch term Lollard, meaning mumbler. In any case, the Lollards were a group of people who had some serious critiques about the way the church, the Catholic Church, was going about its business. Now, you may have already gotten a hint that the church had fallen into considerable disrepute by the 1380s. Chaucer's portrait of the Summoner is just the tip of the iceberg for his religious critique, his social critique, rather, of the church. His pointing out of the rampant corruption of the late medieval church. He wasn't the only one. He was playing to a friendly audience by this point. And one of the drives behind the Lollard movement was to get rid of the corruption of the church, largely by relieving it of much of its temporal power. One of the ways they went about this, interestingly, was translating the Bible. In the later Middle Ages, the church held that it was illegal. It was actually against canon law to have a vernacular translation of the Bible. The version of the Bible the church used was called the Vulgate Latin Bible. Dates back to the 6th century AD, I believe. And the Bible would be read by the priest and then interpreted or told to the congregation. The congregation did not have access to the Bible itself. Well, the Lollards thought that was absolute nonsense. So they translated the frickin' Bible, and that was one of John Wycliffe's great achievements. The Wycliffe translation of the Bible is, I believe, the first complete translation of the Bible into Middle English, and ended up being very influential on subsequent translations in the medieval period and early modern period, including the King James. The theological argument that Wycliffe made was that if the eternal disposition of one's soul depended on one's relationship with the divine, and that relationship was mediated through the Bible, the individual ought to have access to that word, to the holy word, to the Bible. So this was an act both politically and religiously significant on Wycliffe's part. I'll come back to that. Another argument that the Lollards adopted, and some of you may be familiar with this one, is that the individual is capable of having a direct relationship with the divine, with God, without going through the intermediary office of a priest. In fact, much of what the Lollards wanted, preempted by about 130 years, some of the most important components of the Protestant Reformation, which would end up transforming all of Europe. It's a really interesting movement. Unfortunately, it was effectively stamped out by the end of the 14th century, and the reason it was effectively stamped out, and the Protestant Reformation was not, comes down to a single piece of technology, which we'll get to by the end of this talk. But one thing I want to say before moving on here is why it matters linguistically that Wycliffe was able to translate the Bible into English. And this is a theme that I'm going to pursue throughout the rest of the course. By translating what one sees as the most important book in one's culture, or the most important book in the world, into a given language, what the translator is doing is asserting that the language is up to the task of handling that book, that the language can handle the complexity that the book brings to bear. Now, in Old English, this was easy. As I said, there were Old English translations of the Bible, and Alfred the Great, as we discussed, I think, 2 lectures ago, translated Boethius, the second most widely read book in the Middle Ages, and a very interesting work of philosophy into Old English, demonstrating that English had the capacity to handle religious and philosophic discourse. But of course, after the Norman invasion, the English language was effectively decapitated from the point of view of literate culture. Well, okay, move forward to the 14th century, and English has had time to recover. It's adopted words, it's adopted grammar from other languages, mostly French and Latin. But these words have become so naturalized that they are now a part of functional English. So that is, the language is once again capable of handling the complexities of religious and philosophic discourse. This is what Wycliffe demonstrates with his biblical translation. But he also recognizes that the culture is still in some ways split between what we might call native Anglo-Saxon vocabulary and a more Latin vocabulary. And to illustrate this split, I think it might be worthwhile taking another look at his translation of the Lord's Prayer, which we looked at least briefly in the second lecture. So I think we'll go there now. So here's Wycliffe's translation of the Lord's Prayer from 1384. Our Father, that art in heavenes, hallowed be thy name. Thy realm or kingdom come to be. Be thy will done in earth as it is done in heaven. Give to us today our each day's bread, and forgive to us our debts, that is, our sins, as we forgiven to our debtors, that is, to men that han sinned in us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Okay, that probably sounded more or less like the Lord's Prayer that many of you will have grown up with. Pronunciation's a little off, but the words are mostly recognizable. One of the reasons for that, by the way, is that this version of the Lord's Prayer influenced the version that was included in the King James translation in 1611. But the reason I wanted to focus on this translation of the prayer today is that Wycliffe is being particularly sensitive here to the status of the two languages, English and French, in the English consciousness. That is, he's introducing terms from French, ultimately from Latin, into the English version of the prayer, but providing a translation as he goes. In the third line, for example, he says, "Thi realm," or kingdom, "come to be." So he's holding up realm and kingdom as synonyms, which effectively they are. But he's giving two terms. He's doubling. One French, one English. So he's almost acting as a Rosetta Stone here. And if we look down further, we have the lines, "On foriev to os ordetis, thatis orasinis." So again, he's doubling French, English. "As we forieven to ordeteris, that is, to men that han sinned in us." Again, doubling French and English. He's providing the French term and giving the English translation of it. And in this, he's obviously making sure his vocabulary is sufficient to reach as wide an audience as possible, as wide a readership as possible. But he's also holding both the English and the French term up as being equal, as being of equivalent status. And as I said, he's also being somewhat of a Rosetta Stone. He's providing a translation. If you don't understand one of these terms, you're certainly going to understand the other, and they mean the same thing. So the prayer is a prayer in the conventional sense. It's also a teaching tool. Not just a religious teaching tool, but in some small way, it's a language teaching tool. But let's move on. The next major social event that we should probably discuss is the Peasants Revolt, also known as Wat Tyler's Rebellion, named after one of its principal leaders. While the revolt itself has been widely studied, actually it's the most widely studied popular uprising of the Middle Ages, there is, of course, no single definitive interpretation of it, and fortunately it's not my job to provide one. The causes for it arise largely out of both the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. In terms of the 100 Years' War, which had been going on now for almost 50 years, well, this had to be paid for somehow, didn't it? Wars are not cheap. So it was paid for generally by increasing taxes so that the nobles could have enough money to keep their armies in the field. Well, who bears the brunt of taxation? The peasants, of course. And what did they have to gain from the English monarch potentially ruling France? Well, nothing, and certainly not enough to justify the grinding poverty in which they were expected to live in order to pay for their so-called superiors' aspirations to power, for which the poor were also, of course, expected to bleed. And after a couple of generations of this, they were just bloody fed up. Not only were they fed up, but because of the rise of their own political and economic clout, largely due to a reduction in numbers, they were in a position to demand something from their government. And one of the things they demanded was an end to serfdom. Serfdom is the practice of legally binding a person to the land. Most medieval peasants were born as serfs. They didn't have the legal opportunity to leave the areas, the land to which they were born bonded. But of course, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the conditions created by the plague opened up possibilities for mobility, both geographic and social, that many quite fairly wanted to take advantage of because, well, this is a question many of us are asking right now as the mega rich get mega richer during a plague. Why the fuck should the rich reap all the benefit? Well, the long and the short of it was that an army, virtually, of peasants converged on London. The young monarch, Richard II, who at the time was 14, took shelter in the Tower of London. A number of government officials, particularly associated with the Exchequer, were killed. Actually, quite a large number of officials were killed. And ultimately, Richard was forced to concede an end to both serfdom and to the inordinate taxation that had been imposed upon the peasantry. Now, in true 1% fashion, he reneged on his promises as soon as he had the opportunity and was able to raise forces and send in people with weapons to enforce so-called law and order. But The rebellion put the government on notice that it could not indiscriminately continue raising taxes to serve interests that didn't align with those of the people being taxed. That is, the Peasants' Rebellion made very clear that the working people of the realm were not merely pawns, that they demanded to be active players in politics, that they demanded recognition, that their dignity be recognized. Now, arguably, this limitation, particularly the limitation on raising more taxes, significantly more taxes, cost the English the 100 Years' War. But from the point of view of the people who were actually paying and bleeding for it, who cares? What it also did was continue a trend that had begun with Magna Carta in 1215 of a wider and wider swath of the population being included in consideration and even sometimes grudging consultation where policy decisions were concerned. And now we'll skip forward the better part of another century and talk about what for many English peasants was simply a continuation of the hostilities involved in the 100 Years' War, which finally came to a conclusion in 1453. And that is the Wars of the Roses, the wars for the succession of the English crown between the houses of York and Lancaster, which took up another generation or so to finally be settled, and finally was settled in 1485 when Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian, defeated Richard III and effectively put an end to what we politically would consider medieval England. That is, 1485 marks the beginning of England as a modern nation state. We'll talk more about that when we get to the early modern period. In the meantime, let's talk a bit about some more explicitly linguistic considerations. By the end of the 14th century, English, rather than French, had become the dialect, the language of political power in London. Moreover, over the course of the 14th century and into the 15th, political power tended to become more and more centralized in London. And what this meant, particularly with Parliament now being conducted in English, was that the dialect of London became quite conspicuously the prestige dialect. That is, the various provincial dialects came to sound more and more backwards, more and more rural in the condescending sense, whereas the London dialect, particularly the upper-class London dialect, was increasingly seen as a mark of social sophistication, of upward mobility, of success, of power, of influence. What this meant, of course, is that with the backing and forthing between London as the national capital and the various provincial centers around the country, was that there was an exportation of the London dialect to the provincial centers and a tendency toward homogenization, with the London dialect serving as sort of the center of gravity. On the other hand, there was also a tendency, particularly of innovations from the north, to find their way into London speech, to such a degree that the dialect of London became quite distinct from the dialects of the surrounding areas. That is, London dialect became its own dialect to a degree that had not been the case before. Add to this the fact that London, by this point, was the major port in England. And of course, none of the countries with which England traded were English-speaking countries, because English was not at this point an international language. And London, therefore, became a focus of the importation of new terms at the commercial level, terms associated with trade, terms associated with business. So London English goes through, at this point, a rapid change, and because of its status, these changes are relatively rapidly exported to the rest of the country. To be more specific, I should probably say something about Chancery English, that is, the English used in the legal culture of London. With English becoming the language of Parliament, with English becoming the language of law, the use of English in legal writing became increasingly important in the 14th century. Legal documents were increasingly issued in English rather than in French or Latin. Sometimes they were issued in multiple languages, but where multiple languages were given, English would be one of them. Well, what this meant was that English had to be up to the task of legal writing, which is very much as theological and philosophic writing, a precise use of words. So the legal English, the Chancery English of 14th and 15th century England, 14th and 15th century London, became effectively an authoritative written standard for the language, something to which both other Londoners and provincial writers could refer and would have to refer in their own local courts. Now, in Chancery English, a number of northern innovations made their way into the writing, possibly because a number of the people doing the writing came from northern regions. That's the most likely reason. One is the ly suffix, which is a northern innovation, replacing the lich suffix, which was a southern conservative holdover. So rather than saying lovlich, we would now say lovely. Another, and we've discussed this a few talks ago, is the adoption of the th in the third-person plural pronouns, which was ultimately due to the influence of Old Norse in the Danelaw. That is, rather than her for the third-person plural possessive, we would say there. Or the writers of the time would say there, and that's where we get our word there, T-H-E-I-R. This is where they, their, and them come from, and it is during the latter medieval period, specifically under the influence of Chancery English, that these Old Norse importations become standard English. Of course, the style of Chancery English is also important, but I'm not going to address style, particularly prose style, right now. That I think I'm going to save for another talk. One final influence on the development of the language, and a very, very important influence that I need to mention before moving on to discuss particular developments in the language itself, is of course the printing press. The Western invention of the printing press, of course, dates back to about 1440 in Germany with Gutenberg. The Chinese, of course, having invented movable block type some 600 years previously, but that has no influence on the West. Well, by 1473, the Englishman William Caxton had set up a printing press and had been printing English books in Bruges. And in 1476, he set up his first press in Westminster in London. And we might ask why this matters linguistically. And that's a legitimate question. And there are some really interesting answers to it. So let's talk about that for a few minutes maybe. One, the printing press radically transformed the way writing was promulgated. Up until the invention of the printing press, the written word had been in the control of scriptoria. The scriptoria were generally associated with churches, with monasteries, and were spread, of course, throughout the various centers where the churches had enough money to afford scriptoria. These monastic scriptoria, of course, employed large numbers of monks in copying out books by hand. It takes a long time to copy a book by hand. And anything that takes a long time to do is going to be expensive. So books, manuscript books, were very expensive items. Sometimes people would travel quite a long way, scholars would travel quite a long ways to access a particular book in a particular library because copies were just very thin on the ground. Also, because the scriptoria tended to be regional, each scriptorium had its own standards. So a scriptorium in London would preserve London English. A scriptorium in York would preserve Yorkshire English. And it's largely for this reason, this diversity of dialects in which English was written down during the pre-printing press period, that we have such a flourishing in the Middle English period of regional literatures. Because, of course, the local writers, the local poets, would speak the local dialect. And if they were lucky enough to have any of their stories or poems written down, they would be written down in the local dialect as well. And stories that came from abroad, tales that came from abroad, would be written down locally by people who spoke the local dialect, who wrote the local dialect. Even copies of manuscripts from another region would be copied into the local dialect, rather than necessarily maintaining the standards of the dialect from which they were being copied, even if they were being copied from English. This all changed with the printing press for a number of reasons. One is that printing presses, the machinery involved in printing books, is not cheap. So presses, as they came into use, tended to be located in the big merchant towns, particularly London, disproportionately London. If you wanted to have a book printed, you probably had to have it printed in London, regardless of your dialect. Well, the typesetter, therefore, probably spoke London English. So the typesetter would print the book in London English using London spellings, London pronunciations. So what this meant is that increasingly, in addition to the influences that we've already discussed, London English became this homogenizing dialect. It became the dialect in which the written word was disproportionately preserved. And of course, in illiterate culture, the written word virtually always has more authority than the spoken word. Another effect of the printing press was that the written word was no longer under the authority of the church exclusively, as had been the case for the most part with the monastic scriptoria. There was an increase, therefore, in the variety of kinds of writing that would come out. Political writing, political pamphlets in the early modern period were a big deal, and we'll talk about some of those probably week after next. That is, the printing press, on the one hand, concentrated the written word in the hands of a particular geographic location and the business people of that location, the entrepreneurs of that location, namely London, but it also, to a large degree, democratized the written word because it took control of it out of the hands of religious authority. Moreover, because once you've got the printing plates set up, you can print off a virtually unlimited number of books, a number of copies. Books became cheaper. Printed books are a lot cheaper than manuscript books. This increased the number of books available, increased also the size of the reading public, and in a kind of a feedback loop, the demand for books, all of which served to cement the London dialect as the prestige dialect. And the fact that you can run off multiple copies of a book rapidly and cheaply with a press, which you can't do in a scriptorium, meant that radical ideas, such as the ideas that had been about during the Lollard heresy and had been effectively suppressed, could no longer be suppressed because they could be propagated much more quickly, much more cheaply. And in fact, I would say without the printing press, the Protestant Reformation, probably the most important development of early modernity, or certainly one of them, which began in the early 16th century, so not too many decades ahead of where we're looking right now, wouldn't have happened if not for the press. Technology made Protestantism possible. Technology was the vehicle through which, I would say even the primary vehicle through which the Protestant Reformation was able to propagate itself, to spread so quickly. But another effect, and we'll see this when we get into modern English, is the printing press effectively fossilizes English spelling. If you've ever wondered why English has so many silent letters, why do we pronounce the word Knight, night, when, say, Chaucer would have pronounced it knecht, the answer is that at the time the printing press came into use in England, English itself was undergoing a rapid pronunciation change, actually a number of rapid pronunciation changes. But because once something is printed and has authority, it changes much more slowly than, say, speech, we still effectively spell Middle English, even though we speak modern English. That sounds weird, but it's true. If the printing press had come into use in England 100 years after it did, our spelling would be completely different. We would actually spell the words we pronounce, rather than spelling words that we pronounced 600 years ago. This, too, is something I'll have more to say about once we get into the early modern period and discussions of the formalization of English spelling, which hadn't happened yet in the late 15th century. Another factor I should probably address before moving on to specific linguistic developments is, and this is probably not going to surprise you, the increased social mobility of the later medieval period as opposed to the earlier medieval period. I've already talked about the mechanisms by which that came about, so why don't we take a look at one specific outcome of that, and that is the gradual dropping off in English of the second-person singular pronouns, thee, thou, thy, and thine. That is, in modern English, in standard modern English, we only have one second-person pronoun in either the nominative or the accusative and dative cases. That is, it's you, with, of course, yours as the possessive pronoun second person and your as the second person possessive adjective. In Middle English, we had second person thu and the in the singular, and in the plural, you and ye. This case is analogous to other Indo-European languages, but we'll take French as our example because French is, I think, a good comparison here. In modern French, we have in the singular second person, tu, and in the plural second person, vous, in the nominative case. These correspond directly to thou and you in what we might call archaic modern English. But the uses of them are quite different. French still uses tu, and English does not use thou. And here what we want to bear in mind is that there are effectively three levels in society. There are three levels relative to any given speaker, that is. You can be speaking to an equal, you can be speaking to someone of higher status than you, or you can be speaking to someone of a lower status than you. Now, in French, tu is a singular, but it's also what one uses to address somebody of lower status. Or at least in older French, that was the case. Whereas vous is the plural, but is also used to address someone of higher status, even in the singular. That is, it's a sign of respect to address a single person, as vous. Thus, when we're holding a door for someone, we would say après vous, not après toi. So in French, when we're speaking simply about the singular, tu is used for equals or subordinates or inferiors, and vous is used for social superiors, or as a sign of courtesy. In English, a different usage came into play. In English, when you came into use as a singular, it was used to speak up, as is the case with vous, but it was also used to speak laterally. It was used to speak to equals, that is, in an intimate sense, in a way that tu is used in French. What this came to mean, and this transition isn't complete by the end of the Middle English period, but it's certainly on the way, is that in French, you can address someone as tu, and they can perceive you as addressing them as an equal. That is, there's an ambiguity. You might be addressing them as an equal, you might be addressing them as an inferior. You can give them the benefit of the doubt. In English, by the time we reach the end of the Middle English period and are coming into the early modern period, thou, the cognate to tu, is a way of talking down. That is, you address your equals as you. So the minute you say thou, you're speaking down to a person. That is, you're assuming a status of superiority. So friends would address each other as you, but parents would address their children as thou. Superiors would address subordinates as thou. You get the idea. So when you're speaking to somebody whose status you don't know, in French, tu is fine, because there's that possibility you're speaking to an equal, that you're assuming equality. Whereas in late Middle English and early modern English, to assume thou, to use thou, is to assume that you're speaking down, to assume that the person you're speaking to is your inferior. That is, you risk being rude. So to be polite, it simply became safe to always use the plural form, and gradually that singular form simply dropped out of use. And okay, uncharacteristically, between the last slide and this one, I've edited all of my sound files and compiled them and found that I'm already creeping up on an hour talking to you folks and haven't yet even begun to address the grammatical items that I wanted to talk about today. So what I think I'm going to do is just call this our historical lecture, stop talking, and actually post a lecture on time for a change. And then in the next lecture, I will take up some of the linguistic details that are still hanging. We'll talk about some really interesting vocabulary stuff and wrap up some loose ends where grammar is concerned before moving on to the early modern period the week after next. So I may post one or I may post 2 lectures next week. Next week, of course, has the long weekend, so technically only one is required, which means I can only require you to listen to one, I suppose. Anyways, I'll work it out as I go. I want to make sure that I'm covering all the ground I need to cover, and I also want to make sure I'm not laying too much work on you. So that's where we are right now. Probably what I will do is post 2 short lectures that you can listen to, therefore, at a more leisurely pace. And by next Friday, we'll simply be up to date and on the schedule that I have posted on the syllabus. In the meantime, thanks very much for listening. I look forward to speaking with you in our tutorial session on Friday, and please bring any questions you may have about any course material up to this point or about your essays to that session, and I'll do my best to clarify anything that's not been made clear so far. Thanks again, and talk soon.